So what we're going to do today is we're going to have a public forum on the question of the weekend, which is the question of the future of nature. And the question is, for us today, does nature have a future? And the question, of course, is huge, so we're going to break it down a little bit into two sub-questions, and then have a sort of deliberative dialogue amongst ourselves about these questions over the space of about 2 hours. We are going to stay on target with the 4 o'clock close-up and the 4:15 departure. Is that right, Terry? 4:15 departure, the big bus will be there at the front where the flags are to bring us all down to the Rodier Arts Center for the exhibit. So we're going to stick with that. We'll have to shorten things a bit, but I think we have plenty of time. I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. I'll start on the right with Kelly Vauden, who is sort of our superstar environmental policy person at Memorial University. She's a specialist. She works here at Grenfell in the Environmental Policy Institute, which is quite a vibrant place. And she works in the areas of water, resource management, rural development. And next to Kelly is my colleague Peter Trinka, who is a philosopher from St. John's campus. His area is mostly political philosophy, especially Marxism. But more recently, he's been involved in Aboriginal affairs and treaty negotiations between the Gwich'in in the Northwest Territories and the Canadian government. To my left is Blair Adams, who works for the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. So they did send someone. We're going to be very nice to Blair, because Blair is a very interesting man. So he works for the Department of Natural Resources in the area of forestry. He has a PhD in environmental biology from Dalhousie, and he knows exactly how many fish there are still in the sea off the coast of Newfoundland.
Check myself.
And then beside Blair is Jens Zündgen, a friend and colleague from the University of Augsburg, where he heads up quite a powerful environmental institute, the title of which is escaping me. The Environmental Science Center, which is a kind of interdisciplinary institute for environmental philosophy. Jens is both a chemist and a philosopher, so you can't pull anything on him. He knows how to speak both sides of the discourse. And then last but not least, my friend and colleague Jason Wirth, who is a philosophy professor from Seattle University. He is a specialist in shelling, among many things, and that's a specialization we share, a 19th century German philosopher who had a lot to say about nature. But Jason also does many other things, including environmental philosophy, film studies, and he is an ordained Zen priest who, and you run something called an Eco-Sangha meditation in Seattle. I'm going to invite each of my distinguished panelists to take 2 minutes, and we're going to time them, to address the general theme, does nature have a future? And when we've heard from each of them, then we're going to turn the discussion over to the floor. We'll have breakout sessions at the table. You might want to have a facilitator at each table who could try to make things move, or you can self-organize. But you have the two questions, the two subsidiary questions on a sheet of paper in front of you. And so the point here is to take 15 minutes just to talk about those two questions. And after about 15 minutes, I'll call the House to order, and we'll discuss question one among the panelists, and then invite the floor to offer comments and questions for about 10 minutes, and we'll have a mic that we pass around, and then we'll bring the question to a close, and we'll do the same for the second question. But you're not held hostage. You can get up. You can go and do all those important things that Kyla said we have to do at the registration table, and I think there's a nutritional break upstairs is a possibility, and there's coffee at the back. So why don't we start with Kelly? Okay. Kelly, does nature have a future?
Yes. I'm done. No. So my short answer is yes. I think the more interesting question is, what kind of future does nature have? But I'll come back to that. I wanted to start out by raising the issue of terminology, and so that we give some thought to how we conceive of nature. And I'm sure each of us conceive of it differently, with certainly some commonalities. So I want to talk about the importance of how we construct meanings of words like nature or the environment or the Anthropocene, and to encourage us to think about the very real consequences of those meanings that we assign to these words for how we understand things, how we make decisions, and how we behave in the world, and as a result, what the future of nature will look like. So when I asked you to think about what you think of when you think of words like environment or nature. What I try to think of is the environment as something that surrounds and includes me and all other living things and the physical and ecological processes that support us. So from a social ecological systems point of view, if you want to speak in those academic terms. However challenging that is with all the complexities and dynamic features of those systems. The key point here is that we as humans are not separate from the environment. And while that point may seem very, very obvious to all of us in the room, one of the fundamental foundations of the situation we're in today is that we have often seen ourselves as separate from the environment or nature, which is a closely aligned idea, but even often I think we have an even greater sort of idea of separation of nature as something that we observe while we're hiking or kayaking or that we admire, but that we're not necessarily part of. So in this separation of and hierarchical relationship, because it's also separate and also we seek to control in our kind of marriage of technology and the environment, is the foundation for where we are today. So the ethic of control is one versus an ethic of care or concern that we might adopt if we were to better understand the linkages that we have with our environment and the importance of the environment and nature to us and our role in it. So to go back to the question of where we are, and I'll return to words again too when we talk about the Anthropocene in a bit. Yes, nature will survive. It has a future. We only need to look to areas where there have been massive disturbances, volcanic events, nuclear disasters, etc. Life will prevail. The question is, and it will persist, nature in some form will persist. It's us, perhaps, as a human race that ultimately may not, if we cannot be more innovative, caring, and collaborative with others. For as the opening speaker said this morning, these are efforts to change the sort of direction that we're headed in, are efforts that require collaboration between academia and other educators, NGOs, industry, multiple levels of government, and the public to make that happen. Whether that will happen is a question that I am not going to try to answer today. It's a question for all of us. So the question is how to improve our ability to recognize, understand, and operate within complex, dynamic, social ecological systems, the nature we're all part of. And hopefully, as we gain this increased understanding of the connections that are inherent in these systems, to increase our practice of care, collaboration, and community in our treatment of each other and our environment. As I say, whether that's going to happen or not, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that a little later, and everyone else is here.
Thank you, Kelly. Peter Trinka, does nature have a future?
Thank you very much. I will give you three answers, so it's going to be somewhat more complicated, but they are all affirmative. I'd like to continue the work that was done at the Talking Circle, Sharing Circle yesterday. I certainly learned a lot about it. First and foremost, how you can make significant use of a very short period of time. I was told I had 3 to 5 minutes, and now I have 2. So I have to give a very complicated answer very quickly. Bryson, a young elder to be, possibly, at the Talking Circle, made it very difficult to think of what's the relationship between thinking and action. He was fed up with talking and wanted to do things. I'd like to continue that kind of urgency, but suggest that there are difficult problems trying to sort out what exactly is action, what is thinking. And Chief Mizel Joe pointed to our long inheritance of the land and all my relations, which is a term that I've also learned to use up in the Northwest Territories. It's a very different attitude to looking at our relationship to the environment and to our land. In my own work, recently, as Sean pointed out, I've been working with First Nations up in Northwest Territories, and I think there, first of all, our focus has been the youth. So my first absolute answer to the question of the future of nature is absolute because it's from the point of nature or the earth, from the point of view of the young, and that's where I take my hope and my optimism. So we've been working on youth leadership training camps up in Nuvik to see how young people are concerned and energized and aware of what the problems are and what's to be done. And I certainly take a fair bit of solace from that. My other kind of work is a bit older, and I first came to the conflict, I would say, to philosophy from the environment and to nature through a French philosopher, Michel Serres, who in 1992 wrote a quite significant book, I think, called The Natural Contract. And he provides, I think, a conditional answer to the question of nature. Nature does have a good future if we do roughly the right kind of thing, and I welcome this opportunity, which I see basically as an opportunity for philosophers to help facilitate the conversation. I think that's what we're particularly good at doing, so I'd like to finish quickly so that we can get into discussion. We have a future if, according to Serres, we fundamentally rethink what we conceive of as ethics and politics. And my work in Aboriginal communities leads me to exactly the same conclusion. Our notions of what is right, what is contract, what is property need to be fundamentally challenged. And I think their notion of Aboriginal title gives us an opportunity to do something like that. Serres in Natural Contract poses, I think, a significant challenge to us as to whether or not we actually want to change our attitudes and our orientation. That is the pollution that we have been spewing on the earth unwanted, incidental, unforeseen, or is the story a little bit darker? That is, that some of us have actually wanted to pollute. And he has this to offer, very, very short quotation. As certain animals piss on their territory, and this is a bit rude, but I've been asked not to use philosophical jargon, so I'll use everyday terms. As certain animals piss on their territory so that it stays theirs, many men mark and dirty the things they own by shitting on them in order to keep them, or shit on other things to make them their own. This excremental origin of property rights seems to me a cultural source of what we call pollution, which, far from being an accidental result of involuntary acts, reveals deep intentions and a primary motivation. I think that impulse to shit on the land that we actually need to rest on is still really strong, and I think we need to examine that and excoriate it. My other third absolute answer is from the perspective of the earth, and I've been listening to the rich variety of disciplines in addressing this, and one thing that seems to be fairly common and emphasized is that our previous philosophical notions of nature as dead, inert, object-like are absolutely wrong. Nature is dynamic, it is alive, and I would like to offer, somewhat from the spirit of Gaia, it is surprising, and it is resilient, and it is unknown. So I have good hope that there is a future of nature. It might be very surprising and sometimes very turbulent for us, but I think we do not know half of what it holds.
Thank you very much, Peter. Blair, does nature have a future?
I do firmly believe that nature has a future. I believe that, I think all my life, and I think I always will. And in some ways, when I thought about this panel, it surprised me that I feel that way, because there's a tremendous amount of data and information that suggests that maybe it doesn't have a future. So I thought to myself, well, why do I feel that way? What is it? What evidence is there around me that makes me believe that against what I'm seeing as a scientist and as a researcher? And thinking about that, I came to a quote from someone who may have been really one of the first environmentalists in Newfoundland's history, although that wasn't really what he was famous for, and it was Captain Bob Bartlett, so a famous Newfoundland sailing captain. He was heavily involved in exploration of the Arctic, spent most of his life doing things on the limit of human ability, and he was also a witness to some tremendous environmental degradation in the Arctic and in the northern parts of Canada and near Alaska. And I just want to read you one particular quote of his that always struck me. And I was worried that some of the early 20th century language might sound a bit sexist, but after your quote, I'm feeling pretty safe. So taking this from him. So, when you're going out to rest your living from nature, you've got to expect to fight. And yet, it is such a hard battle most of the time against such odds that you wonder why men still do it. I have to ask myself, who ought to know, and the best I can get is theory. Men go down to the sea in ships, ask no odds of the elements, and the very uncertainty of it as a strong appeal. And real men like a good fight. If they didn't, the race would have vanished from the earth 1,000 years ago. We grumble, we crab, we curse, but we come back for more. And man, and this is the part that sort of grabbed me, as far as I've been able to see, is a killer, a waster, a destroyer. He takes the beauties of nature and replaces them with ugliness. But he will fight, he does fight, and against any and all odds, he will survive. It is one of the few things that makes him worthy of respect. And there's two things about that particular passage that I find interesting. One is the relationship at that time that men had with nature, as it was something to be battled against, something that you rested your survival and your living and you extracted things from. I think about that perception versus the way I think people perceive nature when I was much younger, where it was something that we had conquered and that we controlled and that we were something that we were separate from, versus the way I think people are starting to see nature now, which is something that we're a part of and that we can't exist without. And you know, it's in some ways you can call it a parasite or maybe a symbiosis, but that relationship has to exist. That separateness is illusionary. And I think that links back to why I think nature has a future with humans, because the last point of that passage is that we have a tremendous will to survive. And I think broadly across the public consciousness now, we are linking explicitly our survival with the survival and the future of nature. And really that's well, I believe nature has a future. And I see that around me in my everyday life. The places I take my children fishing now have more fish. Some of the forests that were gone when I was a child locally are back. You know, there are more codfish around Newfoundland now than there was when I was a younger man. It's not what was there before the industrial factory trawlers, but it's there. There are some things that I see that are a good trajectory. In my work life, my entire division, all the research I do, the money, the people of Newfoundland and Labrador pay me to do that work is around sustainability of our forests and ensuring that when we do that resource extraction, we don't impinge on that ecosystem's ability to function and provide all the ecological services we expect from that. So in my personal life, in my work life, I see those positive influences. So I believe nature has a future.
Thanks, Blair. There seems to be a rebellion against my timekeeping. And each one adds force to the resistance. Jens, we'll see if you join the rebellion or the side of. Does nature have a future?
Yes, I try to do my best. Well, I think we are living in the middle of an extinction crisis, so, and that is for me the main point about nature now. Normal extinction rates are about a few species per year, and now we are having some thousand species per year, and this is accelerating fast. And well, it is difficult to say this species is extinct. It is much simpler to state we discovered a new species, of course, but we know many species become functionally extinct, so that they are found to be maybe found in reserves or in zoos, but they are no longer here. So over millions of years, nature or evolution worked through these incremental processes like adaptation or natural selection, punctuated by global events like climate shifts and so on. And now the major force of evolution is us. So the species that now survive, their adaptability with humans is the most important point. And about the future of nation, I think of nature, it is more how species can live in human disturbed areas. So there is a future for the fireweed, there's a future for the stinging nettle, but the future of nature will be that we'll have a future in the next 100 years that is much more predictable, with many weedy species, generalists, and which is much less something which rises the awe or the surprise of humans. And this is the extinction crisis that is going on, and this is for me the major transformation of nature that we see. Climate change contributes, global economic globalization contributes, and so on. And what is enough to be done to fight against this? No, of course not. If you compare what was spent for the Iraq war and what is spent globally for environmental protection, this is only, well, it's very, very different figures. And so we must spend much more money. This is one thing. We must also change our attitudes. I think we must not think so much anthropocentric, what does this centipede do for me, but really it has a worth in itself, and that's what has to be learned, and I think it will take generations to learn this. In 200 years, well, everybody will claim about the loss of wilderness and about the loss of nature, but now we have to change also to, work with younger people to do something.
Thank you, Jens. Another rebel. Jason, would you like to bring this session to around with your comments on the future of nature?
Yes. Certainly nature has a future. I don't think that it has a great future in the near term. I agree with you entirely. It's in a catastrophic situation right now, and I also rank the 6th grade extinction event as key to the disaster, much more than climate change. And it certainly has a future, maybe not a good one for us either. But I think those two things are linked together. The last great extinction event, the end of the great reptiles, volcanoes, comet, I don't know, something like that. The hard thing is, we're the volcano, we're the comet. That's going to be a very hard thing for us to look at. So I would say, does nature have a future? Yes, certainly, but in a very important respect, it has too much of a future and not enough of a past. And by then, I'm looking at us, the volcano, us, the comet, us, the asteroid. We're continuously reinventing the wheel. But I think if it had more a sense of the past, if we had more a sense of the past, there's been a strong sense, and we've heard from these voices already yesterday and to some point today, the past of the elders, the Zen masters, the prophets, the nature philosophers, all of them in different respects hold more or less the same insight that we should not be so self-congratulatory. That part of the problem of putting ourselves in charge of the future is that we can't even look at ourselves in the present and see what we're doing. So more of a past means not nostalgia. More of a past means a more radical future. So it's to call out directly the grand amnesia. So the war that we have waged on the voices of elders, the voices of our poets, the voices of our philosophers, the voices of our subculture, the voices of remembering not for its own sake, not for a sense of the antique, but for a different tomorrow, for a real future, and not just for ourselves, but a real future for all of nature. So finally then, I think a real future is also to stand up against the war on the imagination. The war on the imagination is linked to the war on the past, the war on the elders, the war on the prophets. The war on the imagination is to imagine from the wisdom of the past what is precious about the past as we try to imagine a real future for everyone and everything.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you all for getting us launched into this crucial question. So what we're going to do in what the time that remains is we're going to break this down a bit into two questions, which you have in front of you. I'll just read them out. One concerns the Anthropocene, and the second concerns public policy. And for those of you new to the language of the Anthropocene, it is being debated at this, I think, in the next year or two, by the International Geographic Association, whether it's a legitimate term to describe the current age of the Earth as one that is determined by one species become a geological force, namely human beings, so that the Holocene, which was the 10,000 years that have been so good to us, is over, These 10,000 years were marked by a stable climate that allowed for the development of agriculture and the development of human civilization. The Holocene is now over, the thesis goes, and we are in the age of the Anthropocene, where now a climatic shift has occurred because of human activity. So the first question concerns this term. Is the Anthropocene a legitimate term? That is it scientifically accurate? Are we indeed in a new geological era of the planet, which brings the 10,000-year Holocene to an end? Are we in a new epoch in which the human community is no longer one species among many, but has in fact become a geological force? And the second question, related to the first, given the fact of climate change, which of course nobody denies, the fact of climate change, it's the causes that are disputed, what is being done now to manage natural resources in such a way as to promote the flourishing of as many diverse communities as is viable, human and non-human? Is enough being done? And so I would invite you all now amongst yourselves in the tables as they're arranged, or if you find yourself on a lonely table, then join another to discuss these questions. It will take about 10 to 15 minutes to have a breakout session, which will prepare, I hope, the ground for a fertile discussion to follow. So off you go, and we'll check back in 15. Your attention for a moment. Could I have your attention, please? I'll draw the house to order now. A couple small announcements. So apparently the weather is going to be very Newfoundland-like over the next couple days, which means you'll probably want a raincoat if you're heading up the Great Northern Peninsula with us. And on that note, if you come up the Great Northern Peninsula with us, we're not going to force you to go on a hike. So there'll be ways of opting out. If you get on the bus and go up to Rocky Harbor with us, you can still spend the afternoon relaxing in Rocky Harbor instead of roaming around the park. So don't feel that you're going to be, this is not a Boy Scout troop. So we're free to opt in and out. And that goes as well for the evening entertainment. We have a very packed program, and I just want people to, take what they need in terms of activities and time out. So if you wouldn't mind, one last reminder, just to check in with the registration desk so they have your name and if they need information from you. And if you don't have a raincoat, you might want to go shopping at some point. And while you're back there, have a look at the poster session that was set up for us. That's work by students who've done work in environmental policy, environmental science here at Grenfell, as well as some art. The Terra Nova Foundation is there, and a few other pieces as well. And Arnolfo Oxlage has some of the beautiful things that he makes down there as well. So we will have a break at about 10 after 3, a nutritional break. There's some cookies and fruit and coffee there for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back and finish with question 2. So I'm going to, on that note, I'm going to turn to my panelists with the first question, the question concerning the legitimacy of the Anthropocene. And I think I'm just going to invite, my panelists to just duke it out amongst themselves for a spot at the microphone and see what we can establish here amongst ourselves before we turn it over to you and invite you to make some comments. So, panelists, the Anthropocene, a good word?
It's not a word that I was terribly familiar with before I came here, but I have a very similar word from Michel Serres, who we were very happy to actually have in Newfoundland at a similar kind of interdisciplinary round table. In fact, a few of the people were here. I know Barb Neese and Steve. Sorry. When Serres was here a few years ago, he featured a very similar idea from his natural contract book, and he says that we've reached a point where humanity has become an objet du monde, a world object. So our massification has reached a certain kind of scale that our relationship to the earth is no longer the same. I find that to be obviously true.
I would give the term Anthropocene a B-. So I think it's got some good points and some bad points. But I think the most important thing that the term occludes is it does not ask what manner of anthropos. It makes it sound as if the problem is humans as such, as if we've always been the kind of human that we are now, that we always have to be the kind of human that we are now. What manner of anthropos? I think it's interesting when we look at the question of, say, wilderness or the things we want to protect, the things we feel very sad about losing, we imagine them to be so distant from us. We leave the world of anthropos and go into the wilderness or be among animals as if they have nothing to do with us normally. That has very little to do with how our species has lived traditionally through almost its entirety. The rise of the Anthropocene is the rise of a specific way of being human. I think that's what we need to interrogate.
Okay, I think, well, I can live with this term Anthropocene. I think it's not so very good to focus on geological issues. I don't want to offend Anthony. Geological issues are important. But of course, men are moving more pebbles than all rivers on Earth together, and so on. This is really interesting, but the most important thing is the biological issue. So what we said before, that we are now setting the stage for evolution for the next few millions of years. And this is, to me, what matters and what has to bother us.
Sure, I'll jump in there. I guess I'm not sure about the Anthropocene. My first instinct is that it's a giant exercise in ego for us, that we're a geological force. I mean, when you think about it, we're a pretty middling species. We haven't been around that long. There's lots of species that are more abundant than us, have more biomass than us. Our physiology is not particularly impressive. I can't buy that, I don't think. And we have a fairly limited field of view, I think, too, in terms of space and time and the history of this planet. And again, it really feels like an exercise in ego for me. That from a scientific perspective, we think about these types of questions as an ecologist in terms of evolutionary or ecological stable states. You have an ecosystem that can be stable in a variety of different structures or setups, and it takes energy going into that system are perturbations that push it into a new stable state, which can be very different from the previous stable state. And when I think about humans and from a global perspective, I guess the question that pops in my head is, are we putting enough energy in that system to push this planet into a new stable state that's very different from the current one without first going extinct and allowing the system to bounce back from those perturbations? I don't know if we as a species really are capable of pushing the planet to a new place.
I would like to invite the panelists to respond to anything they've heard from their fellow panelists before I throw a little turn in the question.
Okay, well, I think I also agree that there's sort of pros and cons to the word and the use of the word. So on the pro side, I think it resonates with people. And so this idea, people see changes happening around them, massive changes, and we certainly hear about climate change, massive extinctions. So perhaps that the recognition that we need to take some responsibility as human beings for those major changes that we're having, that we're bringing on the world, offers some potential to have people take some responsibility and think seriously about these issues. The danger I see is also similar to what some of the other respondents have, and the ego point came to my mind right away, and this was why I raised the issue of terminology and this idea of our control over nature, and that maybe that the idea of the Anthropocene for some people might be just seen as, we've succeeded. This is a recognition that we are indeed the conquerors, hooray. But so it's about how you, I guess the message that follows yes, we're in the Anthropocene, the so what part. So instead of seeing it as, now we can really control what happens, instead to acknowledge it, to use it as a way of acknowledging our limitations, really. We thought we knew what we were doing, but in fact we've created all these consequences that we had no idea about. So it's really about, I guess, how we frame, once we acknowledge that the impact we've had, how we think about what that means and what we do as a result of that. So, yeah.
I'm going to just throw a little spin in it. One prominent philosopher argued that the significance of this term, if it is a scientific term, is that it actually erases the distinction between natural history and human history, so that, in fact, rather than being the triumph of anthropocentrism, it is the ultimate human humiliation, in a certain way, of the anthropos, in as much as the anthropos now can no longer distinguish itself from the natural history of the conditions of its life. So there is only one history, and it is natural history, and we roll along with it. That qualifies, I think, some of the egocentrism that Blair and Kelly were referring to, or not?
Well, it was a false distinction to begin with.
Natural history and human history?
Yeah.
I'd add to that if we have suddenly been folded into natural history, that's probably only a surprise to us. That is, I think we've always been there. And to erase the notion that we are utterly unique, utterly transcendent, giving to nature something that it didn't have before, I think is false and inappropriate.
But the question is, does the term do this for us? Does it get us there, beyond a nature-history dichotomy?
I think on the good side of my B- grade is that it forces us to look at ourselves in a very, very hard way. And I would like to, in this respect, say that the problem of the 6th grade extinction event is not that things are dying. Death belongs to the way of things. It's a crime not against the living, but against the not yet born. It's not an issue of fatality, but an issue of natality. So when you put the issue of the 6th grade extinction event on a scale of millions of years, I think we have to think that is the extent to which the Anthropocene should press upon ourselves a very, very difficult sense of ourselves. Who we are now, how we are now, is having an impact on things that don't matter much to us in terms of how we are now, but they will be more consequential than most anything we've done as a species so far.
Well, I think I can agree, and I think this ecological crisis is on the one hand about nature, but on the other hand, of course, it's about us and about our lifestyle. And if we all want to SUVs with high consumption of gasoline, then that means drilling holes in Arctic reserves. It's clear, and it is not about greedy corporations or politicians, but it's really about, well, every one of us. And this is maybe also something that is in this term.
Unless somebody jumps forward, I'm going to invite the floor forward. Now, I would like you simply to raise your hands. We have 2 microphones, and do we have 2 volunteers to pass the microphone around, or do we come up to the mic? I think those are wireless mics, right? Okay, I think Gordon Slade, would you like to find a microphone, or could somebody pass a microphone to Gordon Slade? Right here.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not an academic. But I listen and hear to what's happening around me in the world. And I think Jason has said something that is really important in terms of future generations. We are doing something here that has major consequences for future generations. But we don't seem to care about the future generations. It's sort of all for us now. We have to have it now. And what about our grandchildren? Well, our grandchildren look after themselves. And I think about the ocean, the oceans of the world, which is probably the one thing we can do something about in the whole climate change circle. It is possible for us not to put as much into the ocean as we're putting into the ocean, but we don't seem to do it. We've had since the Rio conference 25 years ago, or whatever it was, we've had all these international conferences to deal with the ocean and what we're going to do to protect the ocean, to stop what we're doing that's harming the ocean, but we only talk about it. The ocean is in much worse shape today than it was 25 years ago. And all governments have kind of signed on saying, we have to stop it. We have to do something about it. But we're not doing it.
Thank you, Gordon. So a plea there for some concrete action, particularly with respect to the ocean.
Oh, thank you. So this is what I wanted to say, that indeed we are part of nature and we rely on nature, but we are not of nature. So because we are the only species which has consciousness, and we know what's the difference between good and bad. So I think that comes with a huge responsibility. I cannot keep accountable a frog as I can keep accountable myself for what I'm doing to the environment. So I think responsibility lies with us, and today in my session it was a beautiful thing that someone was telling us about the need of some radical change. Who needs to be changed is us. And in the larger picture, I am thinking whether our meeting here is too much Western-oriented, because there are some other cultures in the world where people are happy with less, and they are not so much looking to this type of hedonistic happiness, buying more and spending more money, or it's about me. I'm looking at my students from Africa and from other from some poor countries, and they live on very little, and they are happy. So I don't know. Maybe I think we should be looking in ourselves and then say, not the Anthropocene like this, because it's not scientific. I think it's more beyond science, because it's about moral values.
Thank you, Gabriella. Wading into deep philosophical waters there. Heather Eaton, would you like to?
Thank you. I just want to kind of counter this comment about who we are with respect to other animals, because all of the studies on ethnography, the social lives of animals, indicate that whatever we call consciousness or self-consciousness, language, communication, sensibility, moral codes, is shared with many other animals. So I think it's an old science to say we are not nature, or we are, what is our actual distinction? And it might be something to do with the level of symbolic consciousness we have. But even then, it's not a moral code, because people like Mark Bekoff has written a book called Wild Justice on the moral lives of animals. So I think the continuity between ourselves and other mammals is much larger than the discontinuity.
Thank you. The floor is open.
The last time that I went mushroom picking, which is one of my primary ways of being close to the ground, I pick chanterelles in the woods here. The last time I went, which was about a week ago, I ran into my, and I've been doing this for about 20 years, I ran into my first ever Newfoundland toad. And it was near Windsor Lake, outside of St. John's, and I was just hiking through some moose trails. So I end up following moose a lot of the time, because they clear the pathways in the woods for me. And I ran into my first toad, and I think I had a definite moral experience with that toad in terms of the hospitability of the environment at that time. Anthropocene is a legitimate term if we choose to if we adopt it as a speaking community. I'm not going to speak for whether or not it's a legitimate scientific term. Scientists will have to figure that out for themselves. But whether or not we as a human community want to adapt it, I think that's up to us. I think it does have problems of suggesting that we are somehow in control, which is certainly not the way I come at it from Sayers. We are massified and have effects as tectonic plates on the world, but that's largely unintended, unforeseen, and now uncontrollable. How we deal with that, absolutely that's the issue. So how we to determine ourselves as anthropos is our problem right now.
We have it, okay. I guess I wanted to speak to, as I've been sitting here thinking about like what other terms we would use, I'm kind of getting this sense of like humans are a pathology, you know, seeing, like visualizing ourselves as a disease. And I'm wondering how effective it's going to be if we just continue to have this guilt and the shame around this when we have such a big task upon us. And so I've come up with these other terms that may actually speak to the behaviors, speak to, I guess, maybe the concepts, just little words that kind of came to me. Like I think, and excuse me, I'm not a linguist or an or a scientist in any regard, so excuse me. Anthropathologicene, petrolocene, plasticine, some of the biggest impacts that we've had have been our inappropriate use of petroleum products. I think of the comment about our usage of SUVs. Well, it's not really necessarily the use of vehicles, it's our over-reliance of petroleum-based fuels for these things. There's many things like industry things, our corporate interests that are blocking progress when it comes to our ways of using these material goods, which do produce waste, I won't minimize that. But it's not really, it's more so the waste that we're producing. It's the CO2 emissions, it's the critical mass that corporations are, I guess, enacting on the world. Yes, we can adjust our individual consumption. However, if all of the environmentally conscious people are the only ones that are adjusting our consumption, yes, that's great politically, but I'm just wondering, like, how do we kind of create that critical mass? So I guess I wanted to throw those kind of comments out to, in case anyone else finds them helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Something to think about.
I have a question for the panel. It appears as if many of the philosophers present are quite keen to question some of the hidden assumptions or underlying premises to how we conceive of nature. But it appears to me, at least so far, nobody has questioned whether or not humanity has a right to continue or whether or not we ought to continue to exist as a species. We seem to take for granted that we owe something to future generations. Perhaps I'm grossly pessimistic. I'm not entirely sure why. There is a voluntary human extinction group. These people believe that they will not reproduce. Humanity is bad for the globe. Let's stop existing. I don't know how viable a solution that is, as clearly the activists involved will, end their own movement, I suppose, at a certain point. But I'm wondering if I might get a serious philosophical response to that. Is there any validity to the idea that we should simply stop existing as a species? And if so, how might we compel people to cease reproducing?
I'm happy to take this. Again, I think when we use the term anthropos, I think you don't want to fossilize that term and say there's something intrinsic to the notion of human being that just screws us and screws everything else. I think that's just philosophically sloppy, scientifically unfounded, et cetera, et cetera. I would just think historically, for example, say if we look at the continent we're on right now, when people came from Europe, it was full of people. It wasn't like there was no one here and just animals running around. There were tons of people here. It was very hard in large portions of North America to walk a full day in any direction and not come upon some human beings. But you look at what's left of how they lived, there's no nuclear dumps, there's no Chernobyls, there's no nuclear waste rotting, there's no garbage dumps that are millions of miles long and big, there's no plastic patch in the ocean. So I think the question is not whether or not we continue to exist as a species. So I think that just simply bypasses what the real issues are. Issue is not what are we biologically, but what do we value? What do we love? What do we stand for? What kind of people do we want to be? If you're okay with being so catastrophically greedy that there's nothing left for much of anything for the next few million years, well, I think we should extinguish that. Those people should be on birth control.
I'm also not interested in people bashing, although I am slightly more interested in man bashing or possibly patriarchy bashing, because I think they're slightly more specific. But Sayers, again, is my hero here, and he says people are, like many things, like language, people are the best and the worst. So it's not that we have a single nasty essence or something like that, but it's up to us to either continue the kind of violent cruelty that we've been engaged in as a sort of grand narrative, or to reorient ourselves. And I think we are the best and the worst. We can do absolute violence, and we can also correct it.
Thank you. I think there's another comment from the floor. This young man.
I just want to add a few points. I'm sorry, I don't have the credibility even to speak, but I think most of the people who are here today either from anthropological or natural science background. I'm a business student, so I just want to add a couple of points from my perspective. So if we just look at the baby boomer generation and the way they used to run corporations, they never cared about environment, they never cared about anthropologies, and that's why we ended up here. And if you look at Generation Y, like in my generation or Generation X, we're trying to make a difference, trying to be more socially responsible, and most people just think or take it for granted it's just evolution, we're becoming more aware, but I think it has nothing to do with that. Right now, corporations see there's a profit. If you become more socially responsible, you're getting more customers, you're getting more consumers, so it's more beneficial. If you really want to change, or if you really want people to change their ways, if you really want them to care about environment, we need to show them that it's also profitable for them, not only just for future generations, but also for them, also for the businesses. Because this is how human mind works. It doesn't matter how much you say to care about other people, about the globe, about future generations, that doesn't work. It's profit, money, fame, and the current impact. If we can show them, changing our ways, changing the environment or caring about the environment can have a beneficial impact to their current life, I feel like people will be more willing to change, willing to make an impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think unless there's an urgent comment, we are going to close the question up with another closing statement from, please.
Well, I just want to say that I think that there are lots of positive signs out there and that we need to look for the incentives and disincentives. So Gabriella was talking, we could maybe use some of her insights from economics, but the problem, there is a lot of hope, I think, in sort of the greening of enterprise, I guess, but there are disincentives to many of the alternatives that are out there. As one of the other speakers said, we know there are other alternative technologies out there, but why is it that we're not moving to different kinds of transportation systems? Well, because there's some profit incentives for certain kinds of industries to continue to operate the way that they are. So I think there's an important role for policy there as well for our government agencies and to play in looking to correct some of those incentives and disincentives. So maybe to provide more support to green industry and to look at some of the subsidies and supports that we're providing to the status quo, I guess. And because it's a lot, and to make that happen, we need public pressure. So you also talked about how to make these things, how to make it more mainstream, how to bring more people into the tent, if you will, which is extremely important because there's a lot of talk about these things, and that's back to Gordon's point, not enough action. And governments aren't going to act without political pressure.
Exactly. This is coming into question two, which is when we're going to talk policy, concrete policy, so that's exactly the right note to close up on. I'd just like to invite my colleague Peter Grattan to summarize more or less what he's heard or give a closing statement on question one, and then we'll have a 10-minute break.
Good. So I'm the guy blocking you from your break, so I'll be very quick. Thank you, Sean. This was a great panel with great comments from everybody. My summation is not going to be much. In some sense, I think there is common agreement that we are in something called an Anthropocene, although Peter's quite right, best left to the sciences. But I like the business major's last comment because obviously the Anthropocene is partly used as a political or even a marketing maneuver to say, hey guys, pay attention to what is going on in terms of climate change, mass extinctions, and so on. We are now driving these things in a way that previously other more earthly things were doing so. And so the interesting thing that we should start to be asking, at least and what didn't come up earlier today and didn't come up on the panel, is that by labeling this post-Holocene era the Anthropocene, we're doing something interesting, which came up in Victoria's question and others, which is now we're treating nature as such as morally valuable, right? It's not that the human and everything that happens to us, that's where politics happens, that's where ethics happens, that's where what I owe something to my neighbor, my friend. But now we're talking about nature in this very global ethical sense, right? And so there's something interesting going on when we say that these rivers and valleys are not just there, we want them there, not just so we have a place to go on vacation or where Peter can go pick his mushrooms or something like that, but in fact that there's something morally valuable to it as such, whether humans stop existing per Victoria's dream or not, right? That there's something valuable in that. And I think that gets back to one of Peter's points too, is that we've used morality to separate we are the moral beings over and against nature. And maybe we have to rethink what we mean by morality when we can begin to say that nature in itself has a moral value, right? Outside of what good it does for us. And that's a really interesting move that I saw throughout, but wasn't sort of isolated. And if nature has a moral value, that means we're not separable from nature, as a number of panelists said. And the other part is, then we could talk more coherently about what do we owe nature, but not just nature overall, but particular parts of nature, right? Because the monolith nature isn't very helpful so much as we get to the particularities. These riverbeds that are threatened by various oil companies, these frogs, or toads, sorry, in the pathway threatened by big-booted men coming for their mushrooms, and so on, right? That we have to talk that way. And I think there's something really underway and really interesting that the hegemony of man that the Anthropocene seems to name is also marking the end of our hegemony when we recognize there's something morally valuable beyond us, and that's a real historical change that is only recent.
Thank you, Peter. Fact of climate change. It's important to remember that the debate is not about whether the planet is warming up. We absolutely know that it is. The debate is whether the causes are anthropogenic. And the science of predicting how high the seas will rise is not an exact science. So there's conservative estimates, which are the ones that get approval, and there are more adventurous estimates. Among the more adventurous estimates is 10 feet of water by the time my son is my age. So this is something that we should be preparing for. And of course, it affects all natural resources. It affects every aspect of the human environment and non-human environment. And so the question that I've put, or we have put to the panel, is the following. Given this fact, are we doing enough? What are we doing in the face of this fact? What are we doing to manage natural resources in such a way as to promote a flourishing of as many communities as is viable in a planet that's getting 2 degrees warmer with higher seas and a greater band of desert across the center of it, and a north and south pole that's basically in absolute transformation. So if we're not doing enough, and I'm sure few of us think we're doing enough, what should we be doing, and what could we be doing? And we have expertise in this room and on the panel in almost every area that this question touches upon. So I'll first put the question to my panelists then. It looks like it's your turn, Kelly.
Okay. We're not doing enough. Again, I have the one-word answer, no. But I do want to emphasize the importance of and value of hope and alternatives, and I think that follows on our previous discussion. There are things that are happening that are heading in the right direction, and we need to continue to work on those things, to point to them, to celebrate them, and try to sort of prop them up and promote them and scale those up. So at least we're talking about things like ecosystem-based management and ecosystem-based approaches in our fisheries and oceans management, in our forestry planning. We weren't even using those words or those concepts a decade ago. That said, words are not enough. But at least there's some discussion. At the local level, there's lots of shining lights that you can see if you sort of look across the landscape. I'm sure you heard from Gordon on the ocean ethic and some of the work that's going on in Fogo Island. There are initiatives across the province and the country and beyond to engage citizens in monitoring their local ecosystems. So we talk about climate change, for example, that engages people in observing what's happening in terms of the changes in their environments, climate and otherwise. And other initiatives to where local people are being encouraged and supported in their work to care for the environments that they're part of. But there are a lot of barriers to the scaling up that I've suggested needs to happen. There's a real commitment to continuing to doing things the way we've done it in the past often, to siloed approaches. There's a reluctance to give away power when collaboration and sharing is what many of us are suggesting is needed. When we see times of fiscal constraint, these kinds of initiatives are often the ones that are cut first, things like model forests, coastal planning initiatives, community-based environmental work, regional land use plans in our province, which offers some promise for a more holistic ecological view, have either not been implemented at all or not been created at all, or where people have tried to do that kind of work, there's been hit barriers and have not been implemented. So we need to definitely look at some of the barriers that the positive initiatives that we have done are facing that are prohibiting them from being more widely applied. And as I said earlier, try to look at what some of the disincentives are to making change, because there's certainly some very real and important disincentives and barriers out there. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here having the conversation that we're having. So.
Thank you, Kelly.
I don't think we're doing enough, and I don't think, given some of the catastrophic scenarios, that we could ever possibly do enough if we want to have something like our immediate memory or history of nature. I think it's also wrong to think that the activity that's needed is going to come from a particular form of science or a particular professional or policy discipline. we don't have, I think, the cultures or the institutions for mass public discussion and debate in terms of bringing everyone who is concerned about it, that is everyone who lives on the planet, together to talk about and to protest in mass public ways what our desires and our fears are. So on the one level, I want to say mass political protest in terms of being fed up and not having our earth shat on to show people's desire is absolutely necessary. On the other hand, I also want to think the global through the local and not wait for some mass political decision in order to try and do what I can. And I'll give you an example of food, which somewhat follows on my remarks from mushrooms and so on. In our everyday habits of dealing with the planet, we have accepted commodification and the abstraction of food to such a level that we're afraid of what is outside in our gardens and in our oceans and our streams and our woods in terms of eating and growing food that we're comfortable with. And so I go and pick mushrooms in the woods because, and my children all love them more than just about anything else because they've been involved, and I know from First Nations perspective that this is something that's very important for your children. Take them on the land, show them where the food comes from, handle it, and then eat it. And that whole experience in terms of raising food and knowing where it comes from, we've completely obliterated that. And so on a personal, local level, I think we have to begin that.
Thank you, Peter. Blair.
I don't believe there's enough being done. I guess I'll talk about what is being done from my little local perspective. A lot of the work I do is around forest management in this province, and research around climate change is a big part of what we do. We've done a tremendous amount looking at the carbon stored in soils and the carbon that's stored in our forests, and we're taking models that have been developed globally and nationally, and one of the things we're trying to do is in our forest management planning, doing carbon accounting for that. So when we say this is how we're going to manage the forest going forward, we know that it's as close to neutral as we can get it. We have, there's a climate change group within government that's working on plans like greening government, changing government procurement, changing the way government buildings are done so that they're more efficient. So I see all those initiatives going on, and I see progress there. Some of the looking at transportation and on the industry side of things and how we can not just reduce costs, but reduce the amount of carbon emissions that come from it. All those sorts of things that encourage me because, as Kelly mentioned, those things weren't even, in the government wheelhouse, I would say even 5 years ago, a lot of that stuff. And now we see it written into our policy documents. There are commitments. We have to report onto the outage and all those sorts of things. That's really encouraging. On the other side, I see that the vast majority of the revenue that we depend on comes from extracting fossil fuels, off our coast. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure how we deal with that and a bigger, broader hunger that we have for energy and how fossil fuels sate that hunger. I like to think about in some way we redirect our consumerism so people value something besides material items as giving them status in our social networks, right? But I'm not sure how we do that.
Maybe I should also add a psychological factor. I think it's quite a big stress to consume on an ever increasing pace. And I think here it would be healthy also for us ourselves to be a bit slower and to go also for these activities like mushroom collecting, gardening, and producing your own vegetables and consuming less. In our session was also mentioned the encyclica of Pope Franciscus, Laudato Si. Franciscus read the books of a left-wing theologian called Leonardo Boff, and he now also promotes a very modest lifestyle and says this could make us happier. And I think it was also a message of Chief Monsieur Joe, that this is also something that changes ourselves, because we are ourselves stressed by this by this tempo, modern tempo, and by the ever-increasing pace of consuming goods. This is one thing, and the other thing, I think on a more general scale, maybe we should give up our romance with the wild in a way, and also take into account the already disturbed areas, because there we can do a lot to ameliorate and to make them habitable again for endangered species. And this is also a very rewarding thing. And in Germany, by the way, we don't have any wilderness anymore. Since centuries, there's no wilderness. But however, you can do a lot for endangered species, and this is really something that is very satisfying and a very nice thing to do. And that's my point.
Of course, we're not doing enough, but the first thing that strikes me is, even given some of the things that we know that we can do, they're not getting done. And I think that's very important. I've noticed in my own life a huge sea change in North America about how science is perceived. When I was very young, science, they put people on the moon, they were making missiles. I mean, science was like awesome. I mean, you felt like you said anything was poetically true. That was nothing compared to science. They owned truth. And now your average person can say, oh, climate science, yeah. They're just a bunch of really poor little professors, and it's a big hoax to get more university funding for their research. And we imagine that science is nothing. It's huge because there's a large set of hegemonic interests that have colonized how we think about even what is already available for us to know. So the first thing we can do is decolonize and dehomogenize our minds, clear our minds. If we can clear our minds, I think it's also possible then to begin to reimagine where we are and therefore who we are. Gary Snyder, many of the elders speak of North America as Turtle Island. Turtle Island is not necessarily just a geographical or political concept. It's a different cast of mind and a different cast of heart about where we are and therefore who we are. So it's not so much new knowledge as a new quality of mind, a more generous kind of mind, a clearer, less neurotic, less colonized kind of mind. I think that's very important. If the mind is poisoned, no matter what you put on the table, it's poisoned. Or in my tradition, the Buddhist tradition, we imagine the problem is this. Since you made it clear to use fecal language, there's a piece of shit on your nose. So no matter where I take you, all you smell is shit. I can't solve the problem by saying, where can I take you that smells nice? I have to clean the shit off your nose. That's first. To even avail ourselves of all the things that we already know from science that we should be worried about and that we should be doing. And finally, I think then, Turtle Island, a different cast of mind about who we are, by where we are. A new quality of mind then allows us, I think, to do more, to have a sense of what other kinds of options should be on the table.
I'd like to ask the floor what they think about what we're doing and what we should be doing. We have about 10 minutes. And if you had a comment that wasn't voiced earlier, you can insert that here too. Laurie?
Great. I'm just following on what Jason was saying. It kind of fits with what I wanted to talk about a little bit at the end of the last session. But the decolonizing mind piece is, of course, acknowledging the way colonization is embodied just as much about our thoughts. And I think that biology isn't separate from some kind of, if we're redefining or imagining what kind of anthropos do we want to be, then mind and nervous system includes our senses, both our senses as we know them conventionally as the five senses, but also a kind of inner knowing and a visceral way of responding to our environment and each other. And behavior coming from that, and affect. We can't separate any of those things out, and we talk about ideas a lot, but really getting into underneath what is our experience of this great amnesia or remembering of the forgetting that we have done. Yeah. And then making meaning from that place that's embodied, and I think then there's hope of a future of nature that we're part of that is more hopeful. And Jason also earlier mentioned the importance of the imagination and the war against the imagination. So those are the thoughts that I wanted to,
Thank you, Lori.
to share.
This is your chance to rant. Would somebody like to jump up now and say their word? Yes, there. I think it's
Gwe, Nundeluizi, Beck Macho Kelligan. Hello, my name is Straight Arrow. I'd like to say Jalasi, Cook. Welcome to Newfoundland. I am Migma. There's a very simple cure to what everybody's saying. As young warrior said yesterday in Talking Circle, Bryson, we're all sitting down. We all must stand. I want each and every one of you today. Tomorrow is gone, or tomorrow's never promised. Yesterday is gone. All we have is today. If I, myself, pick up one piece of garbage today and every day for 365 years, that's a lot of garbage. You times that by a population of a town. You times that by a population of a city. You times that by a population of a nation, a country, the world. How much garbage is left in the world? Not much. We as people are all one. Color, religion, race, it don't matter. We must stand together and protect Mother Earth, because if we don't protect that, we will never exist. Sidnogama.
Thank you very much. Yes, Tanner, please.
So I'm not a philosopher, and my take on this is maybe a little simpler, maybe more practical. I think in an age where urbanization and globalization are, a huge factor in humanity, I think that the simplest solution might be consumerism, and maybe the root of that problem. I think people are inherently lazy. I think they have, everyone has enough on their plates as it is. As a student, I can say that when I go to buy food, or at the end of the day when I have to go buy a desk or something, I think it really does come down to what is cheapest for the average person. The average North American. I think until we make it, I guess, cheap enough to be environmentally friendly, and whether that be through technological advancement and innovation, or if that's through government and policy, I think, at least for us, that would be much easier than trying to rewire society and rewiring people's thought. But that's just my take on it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Tanner. Anyone else have a comment they would like to? Yes, Patrick.
Thank you. I'd like to first thank the organizers for this event. It's been a wonderful experience for me personally. Both this morning, all the speakers in my session were wonderful, and I learned quite a bit. And I think this afternoon's conversation has been very helpful. I have a question for the panelists and for whomever else. There's overwhelming evidence to show that the vast majority of the proven reserves of fossil fuel resources have always been, and today, are owned by nationalized companies. So we often end up in these discussions where we say there are these big oil companies that own, all of the reserves, and they're the ones profiting. The reality is that these corporations, the most important ones anyway, are legal corporations. They are legal companies in a strict legal sense, but they are very special corporations. They're nationalized corporations. They're corporations that are owned and run by governments. Now, Canada and the United States are a bit special in this regard because the majority of our fossil fuel corporate interests are not that way. But the companies that are located in our countries are small in terms of the reserves to which they have control over compared to the companies in Russia, the companies in Venezuela, the companies in the Persian Gulf, who frankly control the vast majority of these reserves. Secondly, there's overwhelming evidence to show that Western Europe and North America benefited disproportionately from the spoils of the fossil fuel economy. Fossil fuels started in Pennsylvania in around 1850, 1870, and from that point onwards, they dominated the energy consumption patterns, not just of North America, but of the world. And the standard of living of North America benefited, and Western Europe benefited most from the fossil fuel economy. What's very interesting is that the future is very different. And the future, and this is generally agreed by natural scientists as well as political scientists, is that the consumption patterns of North America and Western Europe are actually going to stabilize and fall over the next 35 to 50 years when it comes to fossil fuels, partly because of access to technology, partly because of efficiencies in consumption, and partly because there is a change in the consciousness that's happening here. However, in other parts of the world, specifically sub-Saharan Africa, specifically East Asia, India, and China, and to a lesser extent, other parts of the world, that is where the drivers of CO2 emissions are going to come from over the next 30, 50, 70 years. So what a lot of people see and they're worried about is that there's going to be great resistance in the parts of the world that are going to be the real drivers of some of the most intensive fossil fuel carbon emissions that the world has ever seen, even more intensive than what we've done. And the resistance is going to come when people like yourselves or ourselves get up and say, hey, listen, we got to get off this junk. We got to change the ways that we've been operating. And there's going to be resistance from producing countries that say, hey, wait a minute. We're operating by rules by which you operated. We have a right to benefit from our assets just like you benefited from your assets. Who are you to tell us that after you've finished benefiting for a long time from your assets, we can't benefit from ours the same way you did? There's also going to be a resistance from the consumers. Segments of populations of sub-Saharan Africa and India and China primarily, who overwhelmingly are going to be growing out of poverty and are going to want the same spoils. Not everybody will. Hopefully a lot of people won't, but a lot of people will. They're going to say, we want microwaves, we want fridges, we want cars, all the rest of it. And there's going to be resistance there as well. They're going to say, hey, wait a minute. You guys just finished enjoying this great standard of living for 100 years that was run by fossil fuels. We now have this opportunity too. A few times it's been said in my presence for the last few days, this questioning, I think it's very healthy, about the role of the philosopher in this discussion. From my perspective, and I'm not a philosopher, but it would seem to me that certainly within the Western tradition, philosophers have participated and they've added a tremendous amount of value in discussions around the public good and around the good life. And I think that should continue. What thoughts do you have as Western European or North American descendant philosopher types? How do we avoid, or how do we get beyond, or how do we persuade in a non-colonization kind of a way these parts of the world which frankly are going to be the drivers it's very, very likely that the problems will be perpetuated in parts of the world that are not here. How do you speak to those people?
Wonderful, very clear question, and everybody wants to answer it, and we are in fact out of time. So let's see what happens. Whoever's most assertive, go first.
I'm just going to go because I'll be really quick and short. I think it's a little bit paternalistic of us to think that those developing areas won't have enough good sense to make the right decisions themselves. I'm not sure they need to be told by us what the right thing is to do.
One fact and then one possibility. First fact, there simply is not enough of the earth for everyone to live like we do. Then what I take from that, we're going to have to share. So if we want the rest of the world not to destroy what remains of the earth because they want their turn to live like us, we're going to have to stop living like us and share our wealth. Otherwise, it's not going to work for anybody.
Yes, I don't see that the drivers will come from Africa, but surely Asia, Southeast Asia, China, and here I also think the environmental issue is also about health. And of course, we see in China, in the big cities, everybody is now driving a car. But this really raised serious health issues because people there cannot move without masks and so on. And so they already learned that it is in their own interest to stop this way of fossil fuel combustion and to implement a more, let's use the word, sustainable way of living. So I think there's a learning process going on also in these communities, and they don't need our paternalistic advice, but they will learn it also by themselves.
Just to add, I certainly don't want to suggest that new technology is all we need, because I do think we need to rethink the way we live often. But those very countries are adopting technologies that are available at a higher rate than we are, and I think that backs up the point, not just because they're being forced into it, but that they're looking for what the latest, most appropriate technology is that's available at the time that they're able to avail of it. So there's some hope in clean technology for certain, and the rate at which it's being adopted in some of those countries.
Peter? Oh, a thought? Then I'd like to invite Stephen Blackwood, a philosopher here at Grenfell, to close the question. You need a microphone.
Thanks. First of all, I'd like to thank Sean and everybody for organizing this great happening. I guess everybody seems to be in pretty strong agreement that we're not doing enough. Practically we've, Kelly's pointed out there are various initiatives, and both locally and on a grander scale, that people have been trying to implement, but as has also been pointed out during the discussion, when the money starts to dry up, these kinds of things are often the first to go. So these are all challenges that we face, but there definitely seems to be a general consensus here that what we do need is some pretty fundamental changes in in the way we act economically, psychologically, and dare I say it, even spiritually. So it strikes me that all of these ideas that have been talked about, both in response to this question and actually the previous one, there's actually quite a bit of overlap. And the key idea for me was with respect to this question, which was, given the fact of climate change, what's being done to manage natural resources in such a way as to promote the flourishing of as many diverse communities as viable, human and non-human, and is enough being done. Sean pointed out that we have various experts, of which I'm definitely not one when it comes to these, the facts of the matter in terms of our practical implementations of various processes. But I think that everything that's been said does speak to this idea of flourishing. And thankfully, I believe it's Jens, am I pronouncing your name correctly, sorry if I'm not. At the very last there, mentioned this word sustainability, which I thought was going to be a real buzzword for this whole event, but it didn't really come up much. But to me, we all want to live sustainably. That's sort of the message that I'm getting from the discussion. And but the question is, sustain what? And what I think we want to sustain is a flourishing way of life. It strikes me that, to go back to the question about the Anthropocene, and I'll try to be quick here, what people talked a lot about was this notion of interconnectivity. And we are living now in an era where we're coming more and more to the awareness that everything is connected to everything else. And I think that that's an idea that is slowly but surely seeping into our thinking about these things and changing the way perhaps that we behave. So I think one of the effects of that is that this notion of the human and the non-human is in a way breaking down, in that human flourishing depends upon non-human flourishing. And so this increasing understanding of the interconnectedness of this web of life that we're embedded in, we're situated in it. It's not something other, it's not something alien or inert, I think as Peter described it earlier. It's a very dynamic thing. So if we're going to live a flourishing life, we have to fully embrace this notion of the interconnectivity of things and the web of life. Our flourishing depends upon its flourishing. And there's kind of just no way around that, it seems to me. Now, interestingly, this is happening in a time when we've got increasing urbanization, as it was also pointed out. And, as population increases, it moves to cities, we move away from nature. And even as we're becoming more aware of the interconnected nature of things, we're also moving away from it. And so in a way that this perpetuates the idea, it strikes me, that non-human nature is other. So even as we're sort of becoming more aware of interconnectedness, there are various forces that are still forcing us to see it as something distinct from us, fundamentally distinct. Now, this is a problem, I think, so this is kind of going off on a slightly different tangent that wasn't addressed, but E.O. Wilson has this idea of biophilia. And this idea is simply that, we have a certain proclivity, an affinity for nature that's hardwired into us due to, evolution. And when we move away from our connection in that regard to nature, it actually has a deleterious effect on our capacity to flourish.
One last word?
Our possibility for flourishing then is actually intrinsically dependent upon the flourishing of the web of life. And it strikes me that that is one message that has come out loud and clear in this excellent discussion.
Thank you, Stephen. That was well said.